The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
You know, I want to turn our attention now, again, toward the future. First to look to the past. I mean, we've had something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It took an expert level look at issues that we would be facing in the future. A huge component of this commission was leaning forward and offering recommendations that would help make everyone more safe in cyberspace. So how are we doing on actually implementing those recommendations? I don't know anyone better to welcome to the CIG stage than Mark Montgomery. He is the former executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and he's going to be joined in conversation with Lauren Zabierek. Lauren runs the cybersecurity project at Harvard University's Belfer Center, and it's always someone I love following on LinkedIn to find out what the latest is and what's going on as well. So I want to welcome you both to the stage and thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to turn this conversation over to the both of you now. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Suzanne, and hi, everyone. Hi, Mark, how are you today?
Fine, thank you, and thanks to the Cyber Initiatives Group for putting this together.
Absolutely, thank you for hosting us for this very important discussion. So Suzanne just introduced us, so we'll skip all that. Really, you know, let's dive in. So this discussion is really focused on asking, are we as prepared for the future as we should be? As many of you know, and as Suzanne just mentioned, the Cyber Solarium Commission report was released in the spring of 2020. I got to host some of the members during their roadshow for a discussion, and one of those, I got to host Mark Montgomery in a virtual session, as well as we had some people up here for a more personal discussion before the pandemic. But I was so excited by the report and the recommendations. And since then, a number of those recommendations were turned into legislative proposals and even passed into law, which, if you think about it, is really incredible. And I'm really encouraged by the progress that we've made as a country as a result of the report in the last few years. The commission, you know, should really be proud of itself for all the work that it did. But of course, with every effort, we can look back at the progress, assess where we are currently, and then look ahead to the future. And that's where we are now. So to frame this question, are we as prepared for those current and future threats? I really want to zero in on an issue that both of us have actually written and spoken about, and that is the security of our water and wastewater sector. So Mark, let's get right into it. Looking across the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, what made the water and wastewater sector particularly urgent for you and your team to really decide to focus on it, both at the commission, but really also in your work with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies?
Well, thanks, Lauren. You're exactly right. You know, we looked at all of these critical infrastructures, the 16 that are listed. We looked at a few others as well that might potentially be critical infrastructures. And you have to remember that within the 16, there's sub-critical infrastructures like aviation that kind of itself is an infrastructure. But, you know, so we looked at 25 or 26 things. I'd say 3 or 4 actually caught our eye. One was pipelines that played out a little bit later in Colonial. Another was health sector. Maritime transportation security was a third, but really water and wastewater is where we settled as something we felt was it caught our eye as probably the most vulnerable critical infrastructure we're looking at. And that's because I shouldn't say vulnerable, I should say what introduced the most risk. It was a question of vulnerability plus the consequences. And water is one of those unique infrastructures that impacts national security, economic security, and public health and safety. Kind of almost in equal measures. So it's something you really have to have. And we felt that it was a critical link supporting other infrastructures. In other words, some other infrastructures don't work well without water beyond the obvious public health, the people needing water to survive. And that, involves healthcare, energy, pipelines. They all require water as part of their processes for executing their mission. And the other thing that really struck us was that it was uniquely challenged. You know, sometimes when we looked at sectors, we tended to look at the industry and then the government support. And water, more than any other, the industry was challenged and the government was challenged.
That makes sense. And you just said something there I really want to pull the thread on. And that is this concept of how we, I think, often silo our critical infrastructure sectors. We kind of put it into a bucket of, all right, financial sector, pretty good to go, right? The energy sector, well, there's regulations and more of a framework around it. Water, maybe not so much. But as you said, they're all interdependent upon each other, right? So yeah, maybe the financial sector is very well resourced and pretty, I won't say super resilient, but we'll say resilient for now. But it depends on the energy and water and aviation and all the other sectors, right? So can you talk a little bit about this, I guess, tendency to silo and how we can sort of break out of that?
No, you're exactly right. In fact, financial services is the best example where often when we talk about solutions to problems, the financial services people will be like, "Hey, we're doing well," and I get it. On the bell curve that is American critical infrastructures, you're an A. You might even be a natural A, but how much fuel do you have in your diesel generators? Because when that's expired 48 or 72 or 96 hours from now, you better hope Con Ed was resilient and got back up online, or whoever's providing the power to your servers. Because you're now relying on their resilience after some period of your backup, your redundancy being online and then going away. So now you're subject to the grade of the electrical power grid. Now on the bell curve, they may have been a B, and of course at some point they also rely on raw water, on cooling effluent and things for their power plants. So after they've gone through whatever's in their reservoirs, they're relying on that. And so now you're dropping down to the place where the curve's on the other side, and you're in the DF range. And so we're all linked together, and that's what we tended to refer to. And I know in your papers you've highlighted this as well. The water truly is a weak link in driving this. And one of the things I should have said earlier, one of the reasons we found water really interesting was that, like pipelines, and to some degree like electrical power grid, about 20 to 25 years ago, when there was no perception of a cyber threat, we highly automated our water systems. Instead of having linemen walking and starting pumps, opening valves, doing chemical injection of line, manually, we automated this system, and it saved us lots of money and kept all of our water rates low, which we all appreciate. And being run by state and local utilities, that was doubly valuable because there's not an excess budget. So they heavily automated with no conception of a cybersecurity risk. It won't surprise you to hear they didn't build cybersecurity into the automation system to the degree required. And of course, they're now stuck with an incredibly challenging conundrum, which is they can now visualize a cyber threat, both criminal and state actor, and they have to build security back into systems, which is the most expensive way to do cybersecurity, is to try to backfit it in a system where you didn't put it initially.
Yeah, that's a pretty tough situation that we find ourselves in. So on that note, how do we tackle this, especially from a policies or a legislative standpoint? Especially where, say, the EPA is the sector risk management agency, and I would say there's a kind of general under-resourced sense for this entire sector. What are the mix of legislation, the rules, anything else that we can use to start to tackle this issue?
So Lauren, you're exactly right, and you're kind to EPA there. I would say first, I should have wrapped up in the industry and said, hey, there 88% of your water comes from utilities that are owned by state and local governments. And I kind of averred to earlier, they don't have two wood nickels to rub together. They have to balance a budget. People like you and I don't like to pay higher water rates. We don't always vote yes on bonds, for water infrastructure. Unlike a private sector company, they can't raise cash easily. So that's really putting the utilities in the position of not ready for this challenge. And then you bring in what you mentioned, EPA, which and look, 23 years ago, I was on the National Security Council when we were determining, I was working for Dick Clark, we determined the critical infrastrucures and we assigned initial responsibilities. Even back then when we assigned EPA, when I came back from the meeting and talked about it with Dick and the National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, no one thought, well, this is a good match, that that they're ready for cybersecurity. And 23 years later, in a very bipartisan way through 4 administrations, EPA has not thrived as a cybersecurity manager for the water and wastewater utilities. And we're at the point where within the last year, the cybersecurity team that worked with the 52,000 water utilities and 12,000 or more wastewater utilities, that team was about 2 people. And obviously at that point, you're not doing oversight. You're doing like website management, like, making sure the right stuff's, picked up from CISA or NIST or the one of the associations, water associations, and placed on your website. And in fact, they used to have a public disclaimer about an audit process that said the EPA will not provide you with, with a template for doing your water assessments. I mean, that's the point we're at. So you have a dysfunctional EPA, a stressed industry, and when your industry and government partners are that weak, you really have to fix something. And so we've got a number of recommendations that we put into reports. They're very similar. You had a report as well that discussed some of these, and then we've now introduced, have written model text legislation that we have on our website, and we're trying to work with the committees. It starts with getting the EPA healthy, and so there's a significant effort to resource and empower the EPA to serve as the sector risk management agency. One of the good things the Cyberspace Solarium Commission did was define what the sector risk management agency, that federal agency that helps each of the 16 critical infrastructures, what their responsibilities are. We define those 6 responsibilities, and now we actually just go in and write a provision that says for EPA it means this, and then you need to be funded at, and it's a number about 4 to 5x, 4 to 5 times their current budget to even start getting to that. We also say, look, at EPA, you do a great job of putting money into state revolving funds for tackling issues. And recently Congress said, include cybersecurity in that. The only problem, of course, is over the years, only about 0.1% of this money has gone to cybersecurity. And that's because when you look, it's alongside like drought, natural disasters, climate change, rising sea levels. Like the 4 signs of the apocalypse, you can invest in them or you can invest in cybersecurity. Shockingly, the money goes to the 4 signs of the apocalypse, 99.9%. So we say you got to correct that and put an actual percentage down. That'll be a tough sell because the 4 signs of the apocalypse have a lot of fans in Congress. So we're going to have to work that hard. And probably the most dramatic change we have is say, look, we actually have like water associations saying we need to they don't say self-regulate, they wouldn't use the R word, but set our own standards, working with the EPA, set a standard and then self-enforce, with mandatory fines and mandatory requirements. So they need congressional support to get the mandatory and to establish fine levels and to require EPA to work with them. Look, I think that's where we need to start. I think we're going to end with an EPA-led organization. This is like building the NERC, if you know the NERC of the NERC and FERC in the energy systems. Sorry to use the acronyms there, but the kind of industry-led standard setting. I think we want to start with that, and then as the EPA becomes fulsome, move to the EPA having a stronger leadership and oversight role. But if we wait for the EPA to be healthy, then what we're really saying is we're gonna start this whole process in 5 to 7 years, and I don't think we have the time for that. So I'm pushing hard for this. It's going to be a hard push. Congress, this will be a hard sell in Congress. The EPA won't like it because it kind of says they're not that functional, but I do believe it's the right solution.
I totally agree with you, Mark, and I think the way you frame that, kind of this crawl, walk, run, and giving the resources where we need to in order to, just get us to even, partial mission capability, right? I think what you've laid out is really important. So on that note, as you just mentioned, getting this through Congress, right? Having it be this hard sell, I think we're at this inflection point, right? The NCD director, Chris Inglis, he's talked about this, and Suzanne Spalding's talked about this. We can't let, market forces dictate security, right? But I hear so many times from industry that they have to be the ones to innovate. And, I think we need to reframe that debate and, really look to what will get us to security, safety, resilience. How do you, really push this through Congress? How do we convince people in Congress? How do we convince people in industry and the public that this is what we need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a very complex environment because some industries heavily regulated. Financial services would tell you over-regulated. There's 2 or 3 regulators if you're a really big bank and you dip into credit unions and other kind of things. You can have 3 or 4 regulators. And in fact, we probably need harmonization across those regulators. But other areas, as I just mentioned, there's no way EPA with 2 people is doing regulation anytime soon. So you have these massive discrepancies. The pipelines, what we found out after Colonial, when most people were surprised to hear that Transportation Security Agency was the cybersecurity regulator, which was not a surprise to me, unfortunately, because I was part of that bad decision making 20 years earlier, but a surprise to many. They had a shop about the size of EPA's. Now it's a smaller number of pipelines, but still 2 people can't watch 300 people 300 systems that well, or support them. And watch is even the wrong word. There's a regulatory element to this. There's also a support element to this. And that wasn't happening there. So to solve this, I think we first have to identify what we call systemically important critical infrastructure and say, look, for the 120 to 150 really big assets, the big power grid, the companies that provide 80% of our power, the very biggest urban water supplies, the places where we do our what are called sea points of departure and air points of departure for the military, the train, the rail systems, aviation support systems, maritime port systems, and most importantly here, our financial, our financial exchanges and our financial sector. We have to identify those 120, 150. What's been missing from that list, because we've had this list before. It was called Section 9 of Executive Order 13636. It missed by dint of their own actions, it missed the internet service providers who worked hard not to be there. And then, of course, the cloud service providers didn't really exist as they do now when this was put together. So those are the organizations to be brought in. You have to have the 120 to 150 big ones in there. And then you have to say, look, for you, there's a floor of security. Whatever you're being regulated to, if it's above this, great. But for you water guys who don't have any, you have to meet this water security. For you cloud service providers who have none, you have to meet this floor. This is the floor of security. If we've determined you're one of these national security, systemically important critical infrastructures, and we're going to third-party check that. And then, so we're going to have a floor. We're going to have third-party checking. You're going to have incident reporting requirements that are probably in excess of the one that was just passed, which was more for Vicks dry cleaner than it was for a systemically important critical infrastructure. We need to know within minutes, not hours or days or weeks. And we don't need it after a 3-week general counsel review of was this an incident? Now, we need to know things happen for those companies. In return, you're going to get some kind of liability protection. That if you have a significant attack perpetrated by an advanced persistent threat team from a foreign actor, that you're not going to be liable for business you're being attacked because you're one of our vital national security critical infrastructures. We need to provide some kind of liability protection for that, just like we would if Russia, for whatever reason, decided to launch a cruise missile at Southern companies major networking for their power station. We would say afterwards that was an act of war and you have some liability protection, and we prefer you not build your own cruise missile defense systems to prevent that. We need to do the same in cyber and recognize that adversary nation states are coming after us that way. And we also need to provide better intelligence support, better ability to shape the intelligence collecting environment to those top 120 to 150 assets. So for that top group, I think there's a rule. For the broader, companies, small, medium-sized companies and other large companies that aren't part of critical infrastructure, I think we need to, it's going to end up it is generally regulatory frameworks, and where they're missing, we have to bring them back. And I gave you a good example on cloud service providers. They have this argument that says, look, we provide the exact security our customer wants. And I believe that to be true. The customer can pay for less security, more security, and their bill per seat changes. And that's okay as long as there's a floor. But if there's no floor, that's not okay. And so we need to get in there and do it. And look, we've mentioned water, which is a bit of an outlier, but an area where the government's not yet ready to regulate. So we need industry-led efforts until we can get them up and running.
Yeah, you said a lot of things in there that really just stayed in my mind. So glad to hear adding ISPs and CSPs within the systemically important critical infrastructure. One thing, so on one hand, right, we had, I think, the last major push to get regulations through Congress in 2012 that failed, right, and there hasn't really been too much of a push since then. But at the time, you had these business groups that really led the charge to get that measure to fail, right? So I'm wondering, how we can maybe work with those business groups to get them on board. How do we engage in that dialogue? And then also, as we do look to the future, I think that we really need to do what you all at the FTD are doing, is really looking at continuity of economy and how we're best postured to do this from a federal, state, and local organizational standpoint, and also maybe it's a regulatory thing too. I know it was passed in the NDAA in 2021. How did we get there? So 2 questions there, and I know we have only about 5 minutes left.
No, there's a great question. So back on systemically important critical infrastructure, do I think big business will oppose it? I look, the good news since 2012, or bad news, is the adversaries evolved. And, at some point, business understands that this public-private collaboration does need to take off. And I don't think the 2012 business believed that. I think business thought, if you're in telecom, or you're in the banking where criminals are coming after you, you need to worry about cybersecurity. Everybody else, it's a business investment. Do you really, because when you invest in security, you probably lower, it's a rheostat between security and accessibility. And accessibility means efficiency, and efficiency means profit. So as you went towards security, you hurt yourself. I think there's less there's an understanding now that you have to have that rheostat, and you do sometimes have to put it towards security. So I do think business will come around on this. They haven't been always been terrifically helpful in the last year on systemically important critical infrastructure. I think Vladimir Putin may get one more vote as an adversary and drive them into our loving arms. We'll see what happens there. But I do think we're evolving towards having systemically important critical infrastructure with the blessing. If the liability protection can be right, and in fairness to business, government says liability protection, and then right near the end game of a lot of legislation, it gets really slimmed down. So you can understand a little bit of you can understand some skepticism from the business community, and we'll try to work with that. But what you mentioned second is even closer to my heart, and that's the idea of resilience and restoration. That's continuity of the economy. We know how to do this. We do it for the government, and we do it for the presidency. It's called Coop and Cog, and if you watch Kiefer Sutherland, Designated Survivor, you got a good idea, that we put a lot of money and investment and exercising and into making sure the government runs. It'd be a crying shame if the government was running perfectly and the U.S. economy was turfed, right? So what we try to think about is, hey, you have to think about continuity of the economy. How do I rapidly restore our financial exchanges after the loss of the Northeast Power Grid? We can't default to we can't go to the default. The default is FEMA. Hey, it's like a storm. Except when you do a storm, it's about getting to 1, 2, or 3 states with water and tarps and tents and food and power generators to bring hospitals back online. And that's fantastic. They're good at that, and they should do that. That is not what happens. That is not the prioritization we need when we lose the Northeast Power Grid. We have to figure out, how do you get back your financial services so you're not losing 50 to 100 billion dollars a day in unrealized GDP, because all your exchanges are down, and your ability to conduct transactions nationwide goes down. And so we've got to get that back. And that doesn't just mean the financial services. It means what we talked earlier, the telecommunications, the energy, the water, and the financial service systems coming back. That prioritization has got to be done by someone besides FEMA. It's got to be done by CISA and FEMA, and really their shared boss, the Secretary of Homeland Security. And let me tell you how you don't do this, like on the fly after the incident happens, right? That will be a cluster, right? The way to actually do this is to plan for it ahead of time, write plans. And look, the value of plan is not that it matches execution perfectly, but the value's in the planning, then exercising it, reworking it, exercising. This takes really hard blocking and tackling. So when we assigned this to the federal, when CSC recommended it, Senator Peters picked it up and ran with it, and in the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee in the Senate, and got it passed. And in the NDAA, it said you got 2 years to come up with a plan for how you'll do this. So now the administration came in just as the law passed, new administration, solar winds, just a lot of distraction, too much delay. And now after 16 months, I understand they're finally starting to get the step on this. Now, when you give someone 2 years to do something in a law, it's usually because it's hard. And it's going to be too hard for them to get it done in 8 months. So I'm hoping that by January of 2023, they have a plan for a plan. They're certainly not going to have a plan, and I hope it's not like a framework for a plan for a plan. I'm going through all the the stages of denial in the government, but if they can have a plan for a plan, that would be useful. It's got to be across the interagency, but there's got to be a leader. I think it's the Secretary of Homeland Security who uniquely has all the authorities you need and control of the federal agencies that are most key to this. The National Cyber Director has got to be supporting him. The Homeland Security Advisor in the NSC, her resilience team needs to be supporting this, but led by the Secretary of Homeland Security. And then we got to work it, and you got to work with the private sector and state and local governments for years, and we'll eventually have a really good plan in 3 to 5 years. We've lost a year right now, but hopefully it's 3 to 5 years from now.
Totally agree, and I definitely have some thoughts on that. So looks like we are out of time. Mark, that was fantastic, and I always love hearing your ideas and your thoughts, so thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lauren, and thanks to Suzanne and the team at the CIG. This has been a really enjoyable morning of discussion.
I think it's been great, and hats off to the both of you as well. Mark has just joined as our newest CIG principal, so we're in for a lot more fantastic insights because of that. And Lauren, as always, it's so great just to kind of hear from you and what you're working on at the cybersecurity project up there at Harvard. So you have a website people can go to kind of see what you're working on next, right?
Yes, there'll be some more things posted on there, so thank you, I appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time today too, and kind of framing out where we are and what still needs to be done, and more realistically, as Mark was just talking about, a realistic timeline for some of these things. So thank you both.